Hi there, I'm Jadin Cote. I am doing my video assignment for my Indigenous Studies 100 class. My professor's name is Wendy Lorat, and the TA name is Jessica Antonini. At least I think that's how it's pronounced. So my project is on the Aboriginal Australians. So quick little summary of these guys, or these people, I mean. Obviously, they were found, they still to this day live, or originally are from the island, or the whole continent of Australia. Today, Australia is actually like one of the most diverse places in the world. Pretty interesting. As far as diversity goes, they have all sorts of different cultures, different ethnicities, a very large Mandarin population, European population. But it wasn't always like this. Roughly 200 years ago, the Aboriginals were one of the Aboriginals in this case in Australia were one of the most isolated groups ever. Wow. And based off DNA, researchers say that they have one of the oldest DNA chains ever to exist, which is pretty neat. There's traces of it's actually an argument that researchers have that that either these Australians were originally from Southeast Asia and moved their way down to Australia back when Earth was not as segregated, back when sea levels were a bit lower, when land was actually there, when it was a whole landmass connecting the two. And there's also researchers that argue that their ancestors are from Africa, so that's pretty neat too. I'm not sure if it's quite determined yet. I couldn't really find any reliable research to actually say which one it was out of the two, whether it was whether they're derived from Asia or they're derived from Africa. Yeah, but that's pretty neat. So these people have inhabited the lands for over 50,000 years. It's a very long time. They're one of the most ancient Aboriginal people in the world. I guess a lot would be, but yeah. Archaeologists confirmed that the oldest remains ever found were a man's dated at 42,000 years old. Crazy. He was found at a lake. And they found a dye on his bones that they said, so he died, or after he died, there was a big like ceremony kind of thing, so he must have been like a person of pretty high status. Yeah. Like I said, it's said that the people originated and migrated from Southeast Asia, but there are argues that they could have migrated from the next kin, which is an African descent, long before sea levels rose and segregated the land of current Australia. So yeah, this is kind of just my basic overview. So in 2016, there was actually a consensus that showed that these people make up only 3.3% of Australia's population, the Aboriginal people. Kind of reminds me of Canada in a way, where our Indigenous population is very low in regards to the entire Canadian population or non-Aboriginal population. There's actually a lot of similarities between the two that I'll get into throughout this video. So talking about language, today most of these Aboriginal people speak kind of like a mixture of English and their native dialect, which is almost similar to how some of our First Nations people in Canada here speak. I know it's kind of a little bit mixed up because a lot of the words can actually translate, so they kind of to make do for the languages. So they kind of corroborated English and then their own dialect, which happens with a lot of languages because a lot of languages don't have direct translations to English. Yep. So originally, you would be able to come across over 400, or up to 400, native languages that these people used to speak all over Australia. Different groups, different subgroups, all had a certain kind of dialect and a kind of different way of speaking. Much like our Aboriginals communities up here, some of these people still speak their own native language, although a lot of it kind of did die out. A big attribution to why these languages died out is because of the stolen generations, which I will also get into in a couple of minutes here. It's very similar, again, to our Aboriginal people in Canada. Efforts are being made to revive some of these ancient languages in Australian communities. Again, I guess I'll just stop saying that, how similar they are, until I get into it again. But yeah, so some examples of the names that you can find in different geographical locations in Australia for these people. There's the Anangu, which you would find in southern Australia, and a little bit of west and north. The Guri, southeast Queensland, and some parts of Wales. Again, the Guri is where you would find that language. The Nunga, you'd find that in South Australia. The Noongar, southwest Australia, is where you would come across that language. The Palawa, you would find that in Tasmania. Interesting stuff. This is a very short list of the ones I could come across online and that I could actually pronounce. So on to the next page here. So talking a bit about their culture. Like many other cultures, a lot of it consists of dances, ceremonies, spiritual higher ups, like spiritual, the big guy upstairs, so to say, like who their guys was, centered in dream time and mythology. So basically what that means is they relied heavily upon their dreams to kind of determine what's going on in their physical world, which I find is pretty neat. I think that has a lot to do with like the unconscious, so they must have been some heavy believers in what goes on in your head kind of thing, like in your unconscious, like when you're sleeping and stuff, which is pretty cool. They heavily rely on oral history, which is like just passing down stories verbally through generations and stuff like that, depicted on real events that happened for that group of people. They also believe in the Creator, again, much like First Nations people. They believe that certain creators created certain areas, is what they believe. It's pretty cool. So they have different ones, kind of thing. Well, different groups, anyway, that differ for the different groups. An example of this would be the rainbow serpent, a major ancestral being among the Aboriginal. So that's like one of the very major ones for them that they believed in. Maybe comparable to what we would call God and stuff like that. The Balaam of Bunjil, regarded as a major and primary creator spirit in Southeast Australia. They relied on ceremonies as a rite of passage. Let's say, for example, a young boy turning into a man, there would be a ceremony that would confirm him, just like how kind of like the Jewish people have their ceremony for their young men to turn into men. They had a lot of ceremonies around death, marriage, and burials, much like a lot of other cultures and groups and stuff like that. For the most part, men conducted ceremonies where women were looked at as the knowledge holders. Again, much like our First Nations here in Canada regarded the men and women. Some examples of ceremonies would include the Abora. This would be the initiation for young boys into men ceremony, like the one I mentioned. They called it Abora. There's also the Ilma, public ceremony and dance. Like I said, it was a public kind of thing, so like people were welcome to come watch and they would dance. I think it would maybe be similar to like a powwow kind of thing. They had smoking ceremonies again, like the First Nations people here, where we smoke our peace pipe as a way of cleansing and connecting with our Creator, which is pretty neat. So as far as recreation goes, they play a game similar to soccer with two goals and like a ball like thing, and yeah, they would kick it around and get goals. Pretty cool. So yeah, like I was mentioning, that I would reference again is some things that were very similar among the First Nations people and like the whole government and all that kind of stuff. As far as genocide and assimilation goes, there's a lot of very similar things. So quick little timeline here. In 1824, it's kind of crazy. People were at the British government allowed its settlers authorization to shoot the Aboriginal people, just to shoot them. Crazy, absurd, awful. Yep. Britain settled the land back in 1788. Would have been one of their very first encounters with the Aboriginals people down there. At this time, epidemics flourished and the seizing of land began. Some of the Aboriginals resisted the colonizing, but during this, around 20,000 people died at the hand of the Britons. Again, it reminds me a lot of our Canadian history. From 1910 to 1970, government policies between 10 to 30% of Australia led to land, or so yeah, between 1910 and 1970, the government had policies very similar to the 60 scoop, where the young Aboriginal kids in Australia would be put into adoptive services, where they would go live with like a British family, kind of in hopes of being like assimilated, where they weren't allowed to speak their own language, maybe cut their hair and stuff like that. Very similar to a 60 scoop. And they call this the stolen generations. Yep. Forbidden, so yeah, like I said, they were forbidden to speak language. Their names would be changed. So, and then in 2008, the actual same year that Stephen Harper did his public apology for like residential schools, 60 scoop, all that kind of stuff, the Australian government declared a national apology for the wrongdoings and promised to work to reduce social disparities between the Aboriginal Australians and non-Aboriginals. Today in Australia, only 3% of Australia has Aboriginal heritage, which is awful. Today, these people fight for recognition and restitution from the Aussie government. The state of Victoria is working towards a first-of-its-kind treaty there, because one was never signed there, so they're kind of working towards having that done with their Aboriginal people. That would address a compensation, perhaps like money, or maybe they'd change curriculums like how they did here in Canada for our Aboriginal people. However, this has never been done in Australian history. So this would make it the only country in the British Commonwealth to not have an existing treaty with its original people or the original inhabitants of the country. Yep. I'd like to credit a lot of the information that I got to National Geographic. I found a lot of great information on there. One thing I would like to add is the generational effects for these Australian Aboriginals. I couldn't believe how similar their Aboriginals and our Aboriginals here in Canada are, and like how the whole assimilation, being taken away from their families as children and stuff like that, are very similar to our history. Yeah, I didn't know this before until I researched it. Very interesting stuff. It's too bad that the they didn't have any prior existing treaties, and I hope things swing their way for them, and they can come up with a way to kind of restore this between the government over there and their Aboriginal people. Again, Jadin Cote here, signing off. Thank you very much. Bye.